We got a really weird fight, and a crossroads fight at that. At middleweight, we have Brad Tavares taking on Antonio Carlos Jr. Cara de Sapato, which is known more colloquially, I guess, as Shoeface. I don't know if you want to go around calling your friends Cara de Sapato. You could if you're an English speaker, and nobody's going to know what you're saying. No. Hopefully they don't have a lick of Portuguese in their back pocket. But Matt, I look at this fight as two guys that have taken on really good competition in their last two fights, and they haven't won them. And for Brad Tavares, a loss to Israel Adesanya, and then a loss to Edmund Shabazian. And you look at the Shabazian loss, and it's weird because he looked so poor against Derek Brunson, but he looked amazing against Brad Tavares. And I remember that fight, it was about a year and a bit ago. I had parlayed Shabazian with Jairzinho Rosenstrike to get a win, and I hit it big. The odds were great on those two guys, and I got really lucky, I guess I should say. And for Antonio Carlos Jr., a loss to Ian Heinisch and then a loss to Uriah Hall by split decision. And you might say, well, pump the brakes, Craig. High-level competition definitely sides more with Tavares than it does with Carlos Jr. Uriah Hall is a good fighter. He just beat...
Here's the thing, too. Just talk about the split decision. Uriah Hall beat the brakes off Shoeface. Like, that wasn't a very close fight. It was, what do you consider more? Me, and it's not like Shoeface was even going for submissions. It was, he went for takedowns on Uriah Hall, and Uriah Hall just beat him up on the feet. Like, it's weird that it was a split.
And then the fight that Shoeface had against Ian Heinisch, he was successful in the first round. I had him winning the first. In the second and third, he kind of tailed off. He started to get hit, and his wrestling wasn't very good. And that's a real parallel that you can kind of draw between these fights in the fact that Brad Tavares, mostly known as a wrestler, and again, an Extreme Couture guy. So what is he? He's a wrestle boxer, like everybody else.
And a great case of it, too.
At Extreme Couture. And yeah, if you really want to point to Brad Tavares' career, it's so funny. The knockouts. The guy does not knock people out, and there was such a length of time between knockout A to knockout B. So knockout A in the UFC was way back in 2011, January 1st. He beat Phil Baroni at UFC 125.
This was so long ago, they were still naming the pay-per-views. UFC 125 Resolution.
Because it was on New Year's Day. So way back then, and then he takes years off between that and his finish over Krzysztof Jotko back in 2018. And then he lost the two fights following. For Antonio Carlos Jr., he won the Ultimate Fighter at heavyweight, weighed in at 212 pounds to beat, maybe not the best level of competition on the Ultimate Fighter, Brazil Season 3, but still good enough. He's a very credentialed black belt in jiu-jitsu, and that's kind of been the staple of a lot of his fights. You go back and you watch it. He beats Vitor Miranda to win the title, if you will. He moves down to 205, loses to Pat Cummins, beats Eddie Gordon, so on and so forth. Has a finished loss to Dan Kelly.
I held that against him for a long time.
That's fair. And then you look at the wins. He beats Leonardo Guimaraes. He beats Marvin Vettori, beats Eric Spicely by submission. Spicely normally submits guys if he's going to win. Beats Jack Marshman by submission, beats Tim Bosch by submission. Has a bunch of bookings with Derek Brunson and Elias Theodorou that fall through, and then he lost those last two in a row. And the fight that I point to, again, like I said, the Ian Heinisch fight, where in the first round he's trying to get on top of Ian Heinisch. Ian Heinisch decides that he's just going to mash buttons and just keep going Granby roll. And it got him out of all of those bad positions. And then in the second and third round, when Shoeface started to slow down, that's when Heinisch got top position, was really able to get on him. The last thing I want to say, Antonio Carlos Jr. has one of the longest reaches that you're ever going to see in this division at 79 inches. He always has a reach advantage. He has one in this fight against Tavares. He had a huge one against Heinisch and a good one against Hall. He never uses it to his advantage. He is one of the weirdest strikers in MMA, and we talk about it. You don't see a lot of people finding success when they hit like this, or at the end of their punch, they end up hitting with the wrist.
Gaethje's like the only one.
Shoeface is one of those guys where he'll throw his right hand out there and hit with his wrist, and sometimes it gets guys, but he just doesn't do a great job of his striking because he's such a good grappler. And then when he goes to close distance and go for takedowns, I've seen him do trips where he grabs the body first. Like, he just does weird types of takedowns. Against Brad Tavares, that's going to be an odd matchup.
I don't think it will be. Again, we're talking about the wrestling of Brad Tavares. When's the last time you saw him even shoot a takedown? Like, Brad Tavares is a good fighter, don't get me wrong. He's been in the top 15 for a while. But Brad Tavares is a perfect case of you're getting moved up in the ranks because you're fighting a prospect. And I'm not trying to throw shade at Brad Tavares, but he was like number 15 before he fought Adesanya, and he moved up like 5 spots before the booking. That doesn't make any sense. And you look at his wins. Yes, he has nice ones, but the Jocko knockout win is suspect because Jocko had been knocked out 2 fights previously, and that was his 3rd knockout loss in a row. So you beat a guy, your best win is a guy who was coming off 2 knockout losses. The Theodoro fight was way too close, and I know it's hard to look good against Elias Theodoro. Everyone knows that because he's just kind of wacky, but so you have a questionable win over Elias Theodoro. You have a split over win against Malik Aleix, and you beat Talis Leites. Like, it's a good run. I also don't like this other thing about Brad Tavares. He takes a lot of time off in between fights. And I know that's more of a case as of lately, but you look at the Adesanya fight. So he fights Adesanya, takes about a year off, well, a little over a year, then fights Shabazian. Now he's on another year-plus layoff, and it does worry me. It'd be different if, okay, you lose to Adesanya, no big deal. Even if he had lost to Shabazian, but at least shown a different fighter, I'd be like, okay, he's using his time off wisely. He looked worse against Shabazian. Like, some fighters look better when they do take time off. It allows them to really heal their body 100% and work more on skills, not just, okay, I'm jumping into training camp. He didn't look like that. When he fought Adesanya, he actually had some decent moments in the fight. He lasted 5 rounds with Israel Adesanya. It's not something a lot of people can say. And then against Shabazian, there was a certain hesitancy behind a lot of his strikes. He never wants to pull the trigger. And that's the weird thing about Brad Tavares. I don't know if that's been the story throughout his career, because you look at him, and he is a decent striker. He should be able to put people away. And you look at the level of competition. Nate Marquardt in 2015 was done. Like, he wasn't having competitive fights with anyone in the middleweight division. That was around when he had got doctor stoppage or corner stoppage against Gastelum. You should be able to finish guys like that. And the fact that Brad Tavares, who is a massive middleweight, doesn't have any power in his shots. I don't know if there is, like, he pulls his punches just unintentionally. There just seems to be something going on with Brad Tavares, and I don't know what it is.
The stats are weird, and this is one of those things with Fight Night picks. We used to go heavy into the stats. We kind of gotten away from it, but in this fight, you brought up a really good point, and this is one that I actually wanted to touch on. The takedown average per 15 minutes. Brad Tavares is a wrestle boxer, but he only averages just over 1 takedown per fight. And he fights a lot to decision, so he's doing a lot with his hands. His strike differential is not great, albeit it is positive. But Shoeface, for what it's worth, he uses striking in weird ways. He's really heavy on his lead leg. If you're a guy that kicks a lot, you can kind of kick it out from him, and it screws him up. And then he has to go into overload mode where now I have to really work takedowns. Then he gets into distance, he gets cracked, and he loses fights. Uriah Hall. You look at this one, percentages are about the same in terms of striking. Brad Tavares lands a lot more, but he gets hit a lot more. Well, you can attribute that to fights against Yoel Romero, fights against Israel Adesanya, and so on and so forth, and him getting knocked out in his last fight. But it's just, the takedown defense is good, 77% for Tavares. His accuracy's bad. He's a wrestler that doesn't go for a lot of takedowns, and his accuracy's bad. Okay, he has good takedown defense.
Then you're not a wrestler.
So we'll have to see what happens in this one, because Shoeface is pretty darn good at his takedowns and lands about 2.7 more takedowns per fight than Brad Tavares. So,
last thing on Shoeface, if I can, just analysis-wise. Luke Thomas said something that I don't think anyone talks about. I think it's a really important fact to bring up. There's a difference in jiu-jitsu, within big guys doing jiu-jitsu and smaller guys doing jiu-jitsu. Antonio Carlos Jr. is a big guy who does jiu-jitsu like he's a smaller guy. I know that's a weird thing to say, but he is very aggressive. He'll go for submissions. He's not control-oriented at all. And we start talking about that a little bit more, how you have control-level grapplers and then you have more submission-based grapplers. Antonio Carlos Jr. will give up position to go for submission. Because for as long as you're on the ground with him, and the third round's a little bit different because he can get tired. But as long as he has any sort of fumes in the tank, he's a threat on the ground. I can't stress enough just how much of a jiu-jitsu advantage Antonio Carlos Jr. has over Brad Tavares.
And it's one of those things, I remember seeing it in the Heinisch fight, but I've seen it in other Shoeface fights where he's on the side of a fighter, and instead of trying to force his way up to really use a lot of energy to get onto the back, he'll kind of slink down underneath and try and work off of his back. He's a great jiu-jitsu practitioner, like you said. You can't emphasize that one enough. So, if we have a look at the Tapology votes before we look at the odds, 643 total votes, 62% Tavares, 84% have him to win by decision. Brad Tavares open to minus 120 favorite. He's now minus 153. Shoeface open to plus 100. He's now a plus 126. We've made it a pretty one-sided prediction, I'd say, which we don't often do. For Brad Tavares to get a win, he has to be efficient with his striking, and he has to want to strike. He has to really let his hands go. Because if you can almost work from a range, if you can work and move and circle away from Shoeface, if you can kick that lead leg, we know how good Brad Tavares' takedown defense can be. That's all I have for Brad Tavares. Now, The guys at Extreme Couture know way more about MMA than I do, and that was an oversimplification from a guy on the internet, and it'll probably never make it to him unless he's like Sasha Platnikov and watches every prediction video.
That's true.
But I have a hard time picking Brad Tavares to win this fight because of the layoffs and the fact that he was the hot thing on the block when he beat when he beat Phil Baroni 9 years ago.
He was never the hot thing off the block.
That was 10 years ago. And the level of competition's there. You beat Lorenz Larkin. That's a big win. You lose to Romero. You lose to Boach. You beat Marcourt. You lose to Whitaker. Hey, that was almost, 6 years ago. And then the wins after that, Talis Leites later on in his career. Theodorou, that again, he's always doing something. He's busy. Jocko's good. And then the last two bookings are good competition. It's tough for me to pick Brad Tavares in this fight.
I like Brad Tavares against the type of fighters who he's beaten. Let's just go through just those 4 fights. Cal Magalhaes isn't a threat to finish you. Neither is Elias Theodorou. Neither was Leites at that stage of his career. And same thing with Jocko. A lot of point-based fighters.
Magalhaes, going into that fight, was 9-2. His record now is 10-7.
And they were way too high up on the card. It was weird. But anyways, those are a lot of people who can't make Brad Tavares pay for his mistakes. And when we bring up the positives of Brad Tavares, it's a lot of defensive attributes. We're not saying that Brad Tavares can go out there. We talk about the leg kick. It's a weakness for Junior, but I don't know if it's a weakness that Brad Tavares can really take advantage of. Against Talis Leites, it was weird because Jack Hermanson actually kind of showed that you could really leg kick him a lot. Brad Tavares didn't do it at all. Like, Brad Tavares has had opportunities in his fights where you look at him and you're like, wow, like he could really become the next big thing. Then you look at his age and you realize just how many fights he has had in the UFC. Just an odd combination, and I don't know. Brad Tavares can still beat good guys in the UFC. I just don't think he's going to be able to go out there and beat Antonio Carlos Jr. And not that Carlos Jr. is making a run towards the title by any means. I just like Antonio Carlos Jr. at this stage in his career. I think he only needs one takedown. I think on the feet, Tavares is going to have an advantage. But Jr. can frustrate you to the point where you might be the better striker, but he's just doing enough to make it even on the feet. And on the ground, I don't even think this fight's close.
So going into this one, again, might not be one that I throw into my card, but fight goes to the distance is -150. Maybe you have a look at that one, or maybe you're high on Carlos Jr. getting the sub. But overall, both of us going with Cara de Sapato, shoe face, Antonio Carlos Jr. to get the win. Another underdog. We're high on the underdogs this week. Overall, really looking forward to this fight as far as the middleweight division is concerned. And it is a great card with Poirier McGregor 2 at the top. And under that, a really interesting fight between Dan Hooker and the former Bellator king at one point, Michael Chandler, making his UFC debut. Let's keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt, as we always say.
Let's get into it.